So we're going to start, basically, roughly chronologically. We're going to move from ancient times up to about the Renaissance, and then the second, third, and fourth talks will really be, second, third, fourth, and fifth talks really will be a little bit of a quick tour of certain topics. The second talk will be around pathology and how concepts of disease developed over time. The third talk, how different types of treatment were developed over time to deal with those changing perceptions of disease. Then we're going to be discussing the history of surgery, a couple talks on that, and then we're going to have the final session on missed opportunities and how medicine excluded some, included others, and how that can, has ramifications that actually, affect us to this day. But now we're going to start way back at the beginning, and let's get going with ancient medicine. We don't know much about prehistoric medicine because it's prehistoric. And the only things we have left are things that left hard, durable evidence. So trepanation is one of the only evidences that we have of actual prior medical activity in the time before written records. So trepanation is making a big hole in the skull. Now, we don't have records, so we can't be for sure, but what reason do you guys think someone might have wanted to bore a hole in someone's skull back in prehistoric times? What do you think? Maybe to relieve pressure. That's actually a real modern idea. That could be what the ancients were doing, but these days we do trepanations to remove blood clots, hematomas, things like that. But there are some societies that practice trepanation up to the modern era, and what was a reason you think that might have been done then? Demons. So you got something bad in your head. What do? You find a way to let it out. So there was a spiritual aspect to the trepanation in that it was trying to open up that skull so that bad spirits, bad energy could get out. I actually found out recently that there was, in the 60s and 70s, a group of, we'll call them recreational trepanists that thought that it was a really good idea and would arrange to have themselves trepaned. I don't recommend it, but there you go. So I'm going to pass this around. This is not a trepanated skull. It's a plastic cast of a trepanated skull. So you can see what this looked like. I'm going to resist the urge to heave it. Now, one thing about trepanation that we do know for sure is that sometimes the procedure, worked, or at least it was not fatal. So take a look at these skulls and tell me which one survived. One on the left or the right? "50-50 chance, people." The one on the right, tell me why. It's smooth. That bone had a chance to actually heal and smooth over time. It's not known if they would enter the dura and actually expose the brain itself, but they would remove the skull either by cutting. You can see that there's pretty much kind of chisel marks on the one on the left that the person did not survive. But other times they used kind of a flaking obsidian knife to kind of scrape the skull away as it went. Now, who had this game? I know for a fact this next slide is a joke, but if anyone ever finds this for real, please tell me, because if trepanation, the game, exists, I want to know about it. So we know that trepanation was practiced all over the world, and ancient Peruvians, where we have some evidence of it still from the 1400s onward, would actually do trepanations as a way of relieving problems with the head, headaches, but also it was seen as a way of dealing with spiritual pollution or spiritual disease. And sometimes they would do things where they would hold guinea pigs over the affected area, sacrifice the guinea pigs, and inspect their organs to see what the problem was. Now that seems a little bit bizarre to us today, but it was actually a fairly widespread phenomenon historically. In ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and especially in Assyria and Babylon in the Middle East, it was well known that haruspicy, or inspecting the organs of dead animals that were sacrificed, was a way of trying to tell the future, but also to tell if someone was going to be healthy or not. So on the left, we actually have a stone guide to a liver. So this liver would be used to interpret where, if you sacrificed a goat, took out its liver, and you found a tumor in one spot, an area that was shriveled, that was said to be what you would use to predict what was going to happen in the future. And if you were doing it to predict someone's medical treatment, you'd use that as a way to say, oh, we need to give them this drug, or we need to give them this treatment, and so forth. Now, in addition to that, there were quite a few medical practitioners in ancient Assyrian Babylon, and some were actually spiritual healers. They were connected with the temples, and others were more secular or lay healers. So there was actually a tradition of both. But in ancient societies, the connection between spiritual causes of disease and spiritual treatment of disease was actually very widespread. Now, we don't know a whole lot about professional physicians, but we know that they existed, because if you've heard of the Code of Hammurabi, it's one of the earliest law codes that we have records of, and physicians are recorded in there. Now, Hammurabi was regarded to be pretty strict by our current definition. So, for example, you can take a second to read that. If doctors treated a free man with a metal knife for severe wound, has cured him, get 10 shekels of silver. Hey, sounds pretty good. Now, if you think malpractice insurance is expensive today, could have been worse. If you treat a free man with a metal knife for severe wound and caused him to die or destroyed his eye, the hands of the doctor shall be cut off. So you weren't really going to operate unless you were pretty sure that you're going to have a pretty good outcome from it. So we know the physicians were not only being present then, but they were being regulated, and their outcomes of the treatments were being tracked. Now we go to ancient Egypt, and it's really interesting in that the ancient Egyptian physicians were similar to the Babylonians and Assyrians in that there were spiritual healers based in temples, but there were also lay healers who went around just kind of taking care of people on a day-to-day basis. But the ancient Egyptians really had no comprehension of modern anatomy. And the reason that's really interesting is because the Egyptians mummified the high status people in their society, and that involved it was a very involved process. The brain was removed. You can actually see the method that they used. A probe was stuck through the orbit or the nose, whisked around to liquefy the brain so it could be drained out. How's that pasta? And then the thorax and abdomens were opened, and the organs, except for the heart, were taken out and put in what are called canopic jars. So these jars had the organs in them. They were then placed back in the body, but the heart was considered to be the seat of the soul, and that was left intact throughout the mummification process. Now, in addition to that, you'd think that would lead to some surgical know-how, but there was apparently, as far as we can tell, no crosstalk between these embalmers and the medical practitioners at the time. So there's no evidence for that anatomical knowledge actually being applied to physicians. Instead, physicians operated under a theory that was called flux. And the idea here is that disease was caused by bad food. So if you ate some bad food, it would become purulent in your intestines, and it would flux or move through your bloodstream to other parts of your body. So if you had a tumor on your arm, it was thought to be the result of that food fluxing to that other place. If you had problems with another organ, that was caused by that rotting food moving to that other place and setting up a problem. So the way to treat the flux was by treating the gastrointestinal tract. So people would be given enemas. They'd get purgatives, massage. Bleeding was fairly common to try to adjust that balance of the food. When you had something bad taken in, you had to remove the bad stuff from the blood before it settled into other parts of the body. And thankfully, we know quite a bit about the Egyptian methods because the writing on papyrus is still there. A lot of papyri in the dry climate of Egypt were maintained and were actually able to be translated after a while. And the Egyptians, in addition to this theory of disease, had a really rich kind of pharmacy. They had a pretty significant literature related to different treatments and different drugs. Now, some things like alcohol and opium do have effects on the body. Other things would, as far as we're concerned, would have been more of a placebo. They wouldn't have had a great deal of actual medical effect, but it was going to be something that was regimented for being given in some disease or another. Now, the Greeks, who were working as mercenaries in Egypt at the time, took a lot of these medical activities and brought them back with them to Greece when they returned home. And one thing that they took back was the idea of temple, which is called incubation. So who's seen the Mummy movies with Brendan Fraser? You guys are that generation, right? Okay, good. So Imhotep, the bad guy in that movie, he was a real person. Now, I don't think he rose from the dead and commanded sandstorms, but hope not. But he was a real person, and he's actually one of the earliest physicians that we're aware of. In addition to being the vizier for the pharaoh, he did treatment, and he was actually kind of treated as a demigod after his death, and temples to him were used as sites of healing. The Greeks took that idea and brought it back with them to Egypt, and instead of Imhotep, they were going to have temples of Asclepius. And inside these temples, there's a little delay. When I press this, I don't want to jump too far ahead. When they brought this back, it was associated with Asclepius. Now, like Imhotep, Asclepius may have been a real person at some point who was then kind of developed some legends around him and eventually got listed as one of the gods in the Roman and Greek, so the Greek and Roman pantheon. But the Asclepian temples were places where, much like in Egypt, you would go to heal, you'd be treated by physicians, but you'd also be kept there until you had what was called a therapeutic dream that guided what you were supposed to do. You went to the temple, you had the therapeutic dream, it was interpreted by the priest there, and they said, oh, you need to stop being a shepherd, you need to move to the city and do this, that's going to cure what's causing your ailment, and so forth. And the temples were largely in non-urban areas, up on a hill, lots of fresh air, lots of clean water, so what's going to happen with most people when they get out of that area? They're going to get to that area. They're going to get better. So one thing that's true throughout all of medical history that you'll see is that people are going to get better on their own, and doctors can often take credit for that. And if people die, we did our best. So it's easy to delude yourself whether the treatments are actually having the effect or if the body's ability to heal itself is actually doing all the heavy lifting with some of these treatments, at least up until this time when we get scientific treatments and evaluate them to see if they're effective. Now, another thing that was unique to the Asclepian temples was a lot of snakes. Now, snakes served a couple purposes there. What's a good reason that you want to have non-poisonous snakes running around a temple? What do you think? Rodents. They eat vermin. They're going to keep disease down. There's not going to be vermin around. And in terms of a spiritual slash metaphorical thing, what do snakes do that might be indicative or kind of mimic the idea of being ill and getting better? They shed their skin. So it was thought to be that they were embodying that idea of healing by kind of regenerating that skin, casting off what was ailing them, and moving forward. Now, one quick thing, the symbol of Asclepius is called the caduceus, but this is the caduceus of Mercury, two snakes. Mercury, the god of lots of stuff. Any Percy Jackson fans want to rattle some stuff off? Go for it. Travelers? Yeah, travelers, commerce, trade, burglars for some reason. But as the Asclepian staff is a single snake wrapped around that. So the staff of actually healing, single snake. Hey, would you look at that? Hey, okay. So I'm not trying to cast shade on the MDs. However, they picked the wrong snake staff as the symbol of healing. Now, one quick thing before we continue. Asclepius, whether he was a real person or not, built up this following, and the health temples that were kind of present under his aegis and were seen to by his priests and priestesses, they did work of healing in that, and the theory behind it actually set up some interesting things. He trained under, mythologically, one of the centaurs named Chiron, and Chiron actually taught him so well that Asclepius started reviving the dead, and Hades was unhappy about this, so he had Jupiter kill Asclepius. But since Asclepius was doing so amazing things, he then became one of the gods in the Greek pantheon. Now that's obviously mythology. Have you guys had a chance to read the funny meme over here? Okay, good, we'll keep on moving. But one thing that's going to have a little bit of resonance for future development is Asclepius had several daughters. And these daughters were kind of the embodiments of different aspects of health and healing. And two in particular were Hygeia, which should be a little bit familiar. That's the basis of hygiene, the idea of preventative treatment, public welfare, keeping balance so that things don't go to the point of illness, and panacea, or knowledge of all the remedies and all the treatments that are present in the world. So these concepts that came from the Greeks actually stuck around to kind of influence how people conceptualized medicine thereafter. Now, this is a talk about medical history. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on the three great Greek philosophers, but we have to talk about them a little because they influenced so many things from their time up through the Renaissance and even beyond. So basically, we're going to do a really quick gloss over the big three. So we've got Socrates, basically told the Athenians that they had to examine their beliefs, not trust what they assumed to be true, but actually really work to justify what they knew and what they thought they knew. His student Plato, come on now, saw that the material world was an imperfect reflection of perfect forms that existed in some alternative, otherworldly area, and you could only really understand them through contemplation. And then his student Aristotle took pretty radically opposite view, where it was in investigating the physical world that you would actually come to understanding of things as they were. And the variations between which people adopt Platonic versus Aristotelian thought really becomes a major issue as medical history proceeds through the Middle Ages and beyond. Now, one thing that was a gift from the Greeks that we should probably have wished we could return is the idea that manual labor is A, inferior, and B, non-intellectual, and that the true intellectual person thinks with their mind and that's it. They don't dirty their hands, they don't do physical things, and because of that, we wind up with a lot of negative stereotypes, but also a lot of problems in medical history when we separate people who think about stuff from people who actually do stuff. Now, this is largely intellectually in our past, but think for a second, what's the stereotype of the internist versus the orthopedic surgeon? Yeah, okay, if I said the word caveman, you're thinking of one of those, but not the other, right? Yeah, so those stereotypes have stuck around with us for quite a while because the people who do stuff with their hands for a very long time are considered to be inferior to the people who just pontificated and thought deep thoughts about things and then let the treatment be handled by others. All right, and real quick, this is I saw this in Rome, it was awesome. In the Sistine Chapel, you've got the School of Athens, all these famous philosophers, and right smack in the middle, there we go, we got Plato and Aristotle. Fun fact, it's actually the model for Plato up there pointing up was actually Leonardo da Vinci. So as far as we can tell, that's what da Vinci looked like. I just thought you should know that. Come on. All right, now things really take a different turn when we get to Hippocrates, one of the founding figures in Western medical history. And I actually should have started off with this. This series of discussions that we're going to be having is about Western medical history. It's not that I think less of Eastern medical practice or Ayurvedic medicine, etc. I just don't know enough about it to be up here pontificating about it. So I don't want to say that by excluding it, I'm thinking of it negatively. I just don't know enough yet to include that in the list of topics. Make sense? All right, so with Western medicine, we can really start an important era with Hippocrates because he basically said that illness, disease, and health are not spiritual judgments from the gods. They're not caused by demonic possession. They're caused by things that we can observe, intercede with, and if we're clever and we look at our patients, we can find the right time and place to treat them and make them better. And this largely worked. It's strange, but it worked despite the fact that the medical theory that he operated with is completely foreign to anything we would consider to be grounded in reality today. So just the fact that it was an idea of really putting the patient first and having that skill of observation and not just immediately doing whatever you were supposed to do really made an impact. Now, his theory of medical practice was probably not created explicitly just by him, but codified a lot of existing threads. And it's the idea that the four humors that were considered to be throughout the body reflected the four elements, and that their balance is what led to health and illness. So blood corresponded to air. If you have a lot of blood, you're energetic. And there were a lot of old terms for people who had an excess of one of these humors. We don't use the words that often now. Sanguine would mean you're energetic, you're happy. Yellow bile corresponded to fire, and if you had a lot of bile, you're bilious, you're an angry person. If you had too much black bile, melos coli, made you melancholy. We still use that one sometimes. So it means you're sad, you're kind of lethargic. And then phlegmatic, phlegm corresponded to water and meant that you were kind of slow and sluggish, difficult to get moving. Other fun fact, the Greeks didn't believe that phlegm came from the nasal cavities. They thought it was actually your brain leaking out your nose, and that the brain was really just supportive, ballast up in your head. So each of these humors corresponds to different elements, and their balance is what determined health or sickness. So if we kind of put them on a chart, we can actually come up with some pretty fun little things that are still with us from this era of medicine. So we can put hot and cold on opposite sides. We can put, come on now, I don't know why there's a delay. We can put dry and wet on opposite sides. And if we combine things that are hot, wet, cold and wet, dry and cold, dry and hot, we can come up with some issues that might face a person and ways to deal with them. So blood was considered to be both hot and wet. If you had too much blood, you might need to treat it by giving them something cold or dry. Sometimes food that was considered cold or dry would be given in this case. Cold and wet. Come on now. Jonah, do you know which direction I should point this to get the best effect? Okay, well, I'll just keep going. So yellow bile corresponded to dry and hot, black bile, dry and cold. And my personal favorite, if you're going to catch a cold, what kind of weather should you not be out in? Yeah, should you be walking around in the cold, windy rain? Now, you guys know virology. Is there anything to that? Are you going to catch a cold because you're out in the rain? No, but we're still in that idea. You're going to catch a cold, and what are you going to have when you get a cold? A lot of phlegm. So a lot of those connections are kind of very indoctrinated deep in our society. Okay, and here's a nice little illustration. There's the happy person, got a good amount of blood. The melancholy person, the phlegmatic person sitting there, cold, sluggish, unable to move, and then the angry person, very bilious. Now, the Hippocratic treatments were various, but they were all designed to address the imbalance of the humors and find a way to get them back in line. And giving people certain types of food, cold, dry food to counteract wet, dry, or kind of wet or hot kind of imbalance. Cupping, purging, enemas, bleeding, especially bleeding, was done to kind of bring balance to the humors. Also manipulative treatments. There's actually this picture you can see on the right of a manipulative machine actually meant to kind of torque somebody and hopefully realign their humors that way. All right, and this one's for my kids. They're here too. Most important theory about the four elements and the humoral theory was Hippocrates one of the avatars? I'll let you stew on that one. All right, moving forward from Hippocrates, we have a few other medical people in ancient Greece, largely located in Alexandria. We had Herophilus, a person who actually realized for the first time in our history that the pulse and the heartbeat were correlated to each other. He had a lot of anatomical work related to disease, but that's been lost. We just know that it existed from other references. And Erasistratus was another Greek kind of rival of Herophilus in Alexandria, and he developed an outgrowth of humoral theory called pneumatic theory. And in this theory, veins have blood in them, but our arteries carry something different called vital spirit. And that vital spirit in the arteries gets transformed into something called animal spirit, which then goes through nerves. He said the nerves were hollow. Yeah, I see your faces. I agree with you. And that when that animal spirit went through the nerves to get to the muscles, it blew them up like you blow up a balloon, and that's why your muscles swell when they contract and get a little smaller when they relax. It's because you're basically blowing them up like a balloon or bellows to make something happen. So that's pneumatic theory. Sounds silly, but you're going to see a lot of it in the next few slides because it was incorporated into the main medical theory of a guy named Galen of Pergamum. And Galen was the unrivaled medical authority for a very long time. He took all the Hippocratic teachings and tried to put them into one comprehensive system. And there had been a lot of different outgrowths of Hippocratic thought, so he had to really pare it back down. He started as a physician to the gladiators in his hometown in now Turkey called Pergamum, and that's a great way to kind of get a sense of how the body works, is seen at firsthand with the gladiatorial wounds. Moved to Rome and actually became the physician to 4 Roman emperors over time, starting with Marcus Aurelius. And he did a lot of really interesting things. He did a lot of experiments, a lot of dissections to try to figure out how the body worked. And he was the one who figured out that if you cut a nerve, the muscles downstream of it are going to be unable to function. He tied the recurrent laryngeal nerve to speech, and he used pneumatic and humeral theories to create this system that was very comprehensive and answered a lot of questions about how the anatomy, the physiology, and medicine interact. Now, here's the problem. His system was very, very wrong about a lot of things, but Galen had an excess of self-esteem and basically was very intolerant of anyone questioning his methods. And because he had this comprehensive system that he could pretty much explain away anything with, he was taken very seriously. Now, despite the fact that he used a lot of experimentation to get to his results, he then said things like this, basically saying, "Whoever seeks fame by deeds need only become familiar at small cost of trouble with all that I have achieved through active research." Basically saying, you don't need to do it again. I've figured it all out. All you got to do is read my book, and you're good. So yeah, a little bit of excess self-esteem in Galen there. And that actually had a really negative connotation because he was taken very seriously. And I'm going to run through a very quick overview of Galenic pneumatic theory and just kind of sit back and let the bizarreness of it wash over you, especially the first years who just finished CV. Glad you already took your test. I don't want anyone putting down animal spirit on their fill in the blank. All right, so here's the basics of Galenic theory. Chyle is what we call the lymphatic fluids that are produced by food in our intestines, and it goes to the liver, and the liver turns that chyle into blood. And that blood is imbued with what's called natural spirit, type of pneuma. Now, when you hear pneuma now, it means air, pneumatic, things like that, but it was meant to be kind of like this weird kind of fluid, not quite water, not quite air, definitely not blood, but this natural spirit was converted from the blood by the liver. The blood actually was pulsed from the liver out to the organs. It just washed out from the liver. If an organ needed more blood, it would communicate to the liver. The liver would send more blood through the veins to that organ. So it was just kind of a one-way wash from the liver through the various veins to those organs. Impurities in the blood could occasionally be removed by traveling to the pulmonary arteries, where they would be removed by the lungs. You'd breathe out those impurities. But the air that came from the lungs back to the heart did not travel in the blood. It was thought that air entered the left ventricle through the pulmonary veins, went into the left ventricle, and in the left ventricle, it would actually connect with the material in the right ventricle. He said that there were pores, there were holes in the interventricular septum that allowed that to combine the air and the blood together, making vital spirit. And the vital spirit was pumped through the arteries up to the brain, and at the base of the brain there was a network of vessels called the rete mirabile, miraculous net, and that converted that vital spirit to animal spirit. And that's what went through all of our nerves, from the brain to the spinal cord, out to the muscles, and allowed us to move. So that's real basic Galenic physiology. And again, those nerves, they were considered to be hollow, and that's what allowed that animal spirit to get to the muscles to pump them up in the first place. All right, so it's comprehensive. You can understand it, but does this ring true to anybody at all anywhere in this room? I know the answer already. I'm just pausing for dramatic effect. All right, but here's the thing. Galen was taken very, very seriously, and what led to this authority? Well, he saw the human body as the creation of a divine entity called the demiurge. Now, this is not an all-powerful god. It was kind of a divine workman, but it was seen as the creation of a divine entity. And when Christianity and Islam spread into the Mediterranean area, that was a relatively easy thing to adopt and switch over from the demiurge to the god of those monotheistic religions. His writings were really widely dispersed, both in Latin. He was in Greek, working in the period of the Roman Empire, and then later in Arabic, back to Greek, and throughout the entire area. So a lot of people knew of Galen. He had a lot of writing, and a lot of it was translated and maintained. And because we had the books, people stopped doing the experiments. Why do the experiments? They're messy. There's a lot of blood. It's gross when we could just read the book and find out what the truth is from Galen. And people took medicine, Galenic physiology, was unquestioned for 1,500 years. 1,500 years. And it's only because people started doing experiments and started looking at things critically again that people actually realized that there were a lot of errors in Galen. So we got 13 to 1,500 years. Now, anybody in here a history major, history minor? Anybody watch the History Channel? Okay, got some of those. Anyone heard the word history? Okay. Fun fact, I did a research study a few years ago on medical history in various American medical school curricula, and it was really fun, and we had some surveys there, but I had one participant who thought I meant taking a medical history, and all of the answers that this person did were related to, taking a medical history. So I had to exclude that one from the analysis. All right, so if you know anything about history, I'm just going to run down a quick list of things that changed while Galenic medical theory reigned supreme and did not change. And because this is going a little bit off, it might not work. So we've got the Roman Empire, Anglo-Saxons invade Britain, Muslim conquest of Spain, the Roman Empire moves its capital to Constantinople, the Roman Empire falls in the west, Charlemagne becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in Europe, Vikings raid throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, the Magna Carta limits British royal authority, the Crusades, several of them are launched from Europe to the Middle East and other parts of Europe, the Roman Empire falls in the east, the New World is discovered, and Spain reconquers the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, Protestant Reformation sweeps through Northern Europe, and the Renaissance starts. All that stuff is happening. Medicine stays relatively stagnant. Now, despite the fact that we have relative stagnant activity in medical theory, the actual nuts and bolts of medicine do get some fine-tuning during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And after the Roman Empire fell, a lot of this material, due to the translations of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and others, moved to the Muslim empires that were in Baghdad and Damascus. So a lot of that knowledge was maintained and elaborated on by Muslim scholars, and they made lots of improvements in things like pharmacy, chemistry, astronomy, astrology, physics, and optics. Not a whole lot in surgery. It was considered to be forbidden to cut into the body. So cutting into the body was not something that was allowed, so not really any great insights into anatomy and surgery, with a couple exceptions that I'll bring up. One being that it was considered to be okay to remove cataracts from the eyes. It wasn't considered to be an invasive technique. Now, cataracts, for anyone who doesn't know, it's when your lens clouds up and you're not able to see through the lens clearly. So they could either use a suction bulb to take the lens out through a cut in the cornea, or use a little probe to nudge it out of the way so that instead of seeing nothing, you can see blurs. You can't focus anymore, but you can at least see something. So it was not what we would consider to be surgery of our modern era's level of sophistication, but it helped the people who had the problem at the time. So a few of the main biographical one-shots we're going to do for the people in the Muslim empires at this time and their contributions we've got, and I'm going to try not to mangle this too badly. We've got Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, and short version is Razis, as he was known in the West, was living in Baghdad and basically did a lot of work categorizing diseases. Now, think for a second about how diseases present. If somebody has a fever and bumps, do you know which disease it is right off the top of your head? Not really. There's a lot of things that can present similar ways. And so the categorization that started with these scholars actually did a lot to help kind of categorize what diseases and treatments were actually effective at a time. He investigated alchemy and actually worked on making distillation of different substances of practical reality. And that distillation not only was used later for the creation of spirits and alcohols, but for different chemical procedures and so forth. And if anyone hasn't put it together yet, alchemy has a bad rap because alchemy is like, oh, they're trying to turn lead into gold and so forth. But the alchemists really set the groundwork for chemistry. And chemistry is just, alchemia in Arabic is the chemistry. So you just drop the AL and you've got chemistry there. So religiously, he was a fairly free-thinking person, and actually he doubted the veracity of Galen and humoral theory. But because Galen had been so kind of integrated with the power structure at the time and the idea of how disease and the human body worked. Doubting Galen wasn't exactly sacrilegious, but it was kind of edging up on, casting doubt on established authorities. And he was actually beaten so badly that he lost vision in one eye when a local person decided he was straying too far into questioning the authorities. Another scholar, Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazan, was in Arabia but worked mostly in Cairo. He did a lot of work on optics, and one of the things that I really love that he did is he completely destroyed the prevalent idea at the time that vision was due to what was called the extremissive theory, and you'll see my super scientific statement of what that means. Eye beams. Basically, the idea is your eyes send out energy or some such thing that bounces off the stuff around you and bounces back. He pretty much destroyed that theory and said that no, it's because your eyes are sensing input that's coming in from around them. Now, he also had this radical idea that hypotheses had to be proved through experiment or mathematical proof and so forth, so, sounds pretty good. Avicenna was probably the biggest name in the Muslim scholar world in terms of medicine. He traveled widely, he wrote about everything. He was very much into Platonic thought, but he wrote a tremendously huge book called The Canon of Medicine when he actually was fairly young. It's 14 volumes, and this book, because it spread so widely throughout the Muslim world as well as Europe, it really left a strong, lasting impression and made Avicenna one of the unquestionable authorities going into the Middle Ages thereafter. And I should mention, because Europe was relatively kind of backward at this time, the Muslim countries were considered to be high culture areas. So actually having medical treatises from the Muslim scholars was considered to be a really good thing. And in fact, some European authors would actually give themselves fake Arabic names to actually have people get their books sold more effectively. Now, he came up with a theory that is, by our modern standard, again, wrong, but it was very influential, and that was about miasma. Miasma is basically bad air, and that if you're in an area where there's bad air and you breathe it in, you can get diseased. Now, if we think about living in an area with stagnant water, swampy air, we can get disease in a lot of ways there. It's not the bad air that's doing it, but that association was what he noticed. And miasma held on for a long time, and we'll see it coming up in regards to cholera epidemics and how that was finally debunked as bacteriology actually came along. Okay. And I think one of the, second to last, we have Averroes. He is actually represented in that same picture by Raphael, the School of Athens. And he actually was another person who kind of was in the Aristotle versus Plato fight. He commented negatively on Plato and Avicenna. He was very pro-Aristotle, and his Aristotelian works, especially in relation to medicine, had a very, very strong influence on medieval scholarship in Europe, and that's when Aristotle became the unquestioned master of all science that the European monks and later universities would adopt in their early eras. All right, last and certainly not least, we have Ibn al-Nafis. He was in Damascus, moved to Egypt, and basically, in addition to working with Al-Hazan on making sure that people understood how the eyes and optics actually worked, he actually described how the pulmonary and circuitry actually works, figured out that the blood circulates rather than just washes out over places. Now, sadly, that knowledge was lost and had to be rediscovered, but he did come up with that first. He knew for a fact that Galen was wrong about a lot of things, and he was publishing on it. He knew that there was no mixing of the air and the blood through the ventricles. There were no holes there. So he performed, it's considered that he may have performed human dissections despite prohibitions at the time because he was able to describe a lot of these problems with Galen. And I really love this quote. So, we shall rely necessarily on verified examinations and straightforward research, disregarding whether our opinions will agree or disagree with those of our predecessors. So it really sounds like in the early 1200s, we're primed for a scientific revolution of sorts in these Islamic empires. So what happened? Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan happened. So basically, the Mongolian hordes came through, wiped out a lot of the, Damascus in Syria, Baghdad. They really did a number on it. And a lot of the scholars and physicians who were working at that time had to flee. And where did they flee? They fled to Europe, by and large. And so Europe had actually already developed universities. And so there was actually a waiting place for these scholars to land and start teaching. And the Europeans were overjoyed because already the sources coming from the Muslim world were considered to be superior, and these scholars were bringing much better, much more accurate translations of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and so forth. So a lot of these scholars found new homes throughout Italy, southern France, and other places where we'd had universities start to develop. Now, universities were established for the three major professions: theology, law, and medicine, and it is in that order. So yeah, being a doctor, that's nice. Too bad, couldn't have been a lawyer or a theologian. But medicine was clearly on the lower totem pole, but it was at least one of the big three professions that people could have at the time. Now, one major thing about the European universities, though, is what was the focal point? What do you think the focal point of study was? Yeah, it was reading the established authorities and knowing what they had to say, because they'd figured it all out already. We don't need to ask any questions, because all we need to do is refer to our resources and read them closely enough, and we can come up with the solutions to our problems. So that's how that was done. Now, I'm a big fan of teaching you guys in the anatomy lab, because to me, it's the one last vestige of messy reality in your medical education. You actually have to deal with reality. It's the only time you do that apart from actually dealing with patients where they don't fit exactly what you'd expect to see. So messy reality tends to make it easier for people to find errors in things and find things that are inconsistent. And interestingly, dissection was allowed at these universities, but it was of limited value for actual learning because it wasn't really investigatory, it was more of propaganda for Galen. Dissection was not prohibited, even though some edicts from the Pope saying you couldn't boil the bones of crusaders to make it easier to return their bodies to Europe was interpreted that way. But dissection was allowed, and Pope Sixtus IV was the one who actually set a bull saying that you could do that. And the first people allowed to dissect were medical schools, surgeons, and artists. Now, these dissections were done once or twice a year. There was no embalming, so it was done during the cold months of the year, starting with the organs because they went bad first, and ending with the limbs because they were a little more resilient. So what happened is that the anatomists who participated in it weren't really looking for anything that contradicted Galen. And if you can imagine just standing around a body with someone pointing at stuff, you're not going to notice the fine details. You're not going to get to notice a lot. And the way these were structured was kind of interesting. Up in the pulpit there, we have the professor who professed, reading from the book of Galen, probably up there. Meanwhile, he's a high status person. Is he going to get those gloves? Is he going to get those sleeves dirty? No. We've got an instructor, an ostensor, who's down there. Now, he's a little closer to the action, but he's still too high status to actually touch anything, except he has a stick. So he points at things that are important related to the thing that is being professed by the professor at the moment. And meanwhile, there's a butcher or a barber surgeon down there actually doing the cutting. And this person doesn't necessarily know anything about Galen, so he's just kind of cutting what they tell him, moving stuff around, and the guy sticks a probe at it, tells people what the importance is, and moves on. So these dissections were of limited value for actually learning, but they were very popular as public entertainment, and they could actually be kind of rowdy. It was a little bit, I wouldn't say it's a sporting event level of excitement, but people would get into duels and have food fights in the dissecting theaters. You can see it was built very deep so people could look down and see what was going on from the stands right there. So the executions of criminals were timed to coincide with the anatomical demonstrations, and it was actually seen as a type of extra punishment because it was thought by most theologians at the time that the body had to be whole to rise up on Judgment Day. So this was a way of kind of, acknowledging that whatever crime this person had committed was especially heinous by allowing them to be dissected. Yeah, and my personal favorite, maybe before I retire I can pull this off, is Fabricius, another, come on. At the University of Padua actually had a posse of musicians traveling behind him playing music as he entered into the dissecting hall. So yeah, gold and purple robes, I'll file that one away before retirement. All right. Moving on to the next one. Now, I mentioned that physicians, surgeons, and artists were some of the first people allowed to do dissection. It was because the commissioning of art was such an important thing in the medieval world that it was thought to be important that the artist be able to represent the human form properly in motion and actually know what the muscles look like both statically and in motion. So, in fact, I think I jumped ahead too far again. Come on. So the Renaissance artists like Leonardo and Michelangelo actually did quite a bit of dissection to learn how the form of the body actually existed for real so they could represent it properly. So one fun story about that is Michelangelo's father was very upset that he was going to be an artist, and he was additionally upset that he would do dissection. It was seen as being pretty suspect. So Michelangelo was out dissecting one night, and his father caught him coming back into the house, and he said, no, I was out drinking and hanging around with loose women. That was his excuse, rather than out dissecting and doing some of that. But it's pretty well known that he did a lot of dissection, and some people have made a pretty good claim that he actually hid some anatomical details in his art, apart from the musculature of the people that are portrayed. So there's one that people are pretty sure of. Okay, we got a brain right there. Others I'm not so sure about. Some people I think are looking at this stuff with way too high a detail. So someone's looking at the underside of God, or so that's Moses, underside of Moses' neck and saying, look, it's the medulla. And this one I'm really not sure about. I'm not sure if that storm cloud is really a kidney, so just be aware. Some people will look to find something and they'll find it whether it's there or not. But these artists did know a lot about their anatomy. And in fact, Leonardo da Vinci made lots of anatomical sketches and discovered things that were wrong with Galen way before anyone else. But he was very concerned about being possibly considered to be heretical in some of the things he was doing. So he kept those very secret, and it wasn't rediscovered until well after these things had been found out by other people. But just for a second, these are some of the images that Leonardo drew. No one else had ever drawn a cross-section before. So he just did that to try to understand how the body was put together. The cuts through the skull there to show the various air sinuses. That's nothing anyone had ever described before. So just by investigating, he was finding all these amazing things. He actually was going to make an anatomical atlas with another person, but that deal fell through. And if you know anything about Leonardo da Vinci, he completed maybe 10% of the things he said he would do. That's kind of optimistic. So he intended to do a lot of things, didn't actually follow through on all of them. The first modern anatomist who actually really started putting a nail in Galenic theory was a guy named Andreas Vesalius. Now, he was the son of a physician living in the Netherlands, and he knew a bit about medicine through his family and was expected to and did in fact become a physician. But as he would walk from his house up on the hill down to Brussels, he would pass the hanging grounds, and the tradition there at the time was to just leave the bodies up there till they fell apart. So he would watch the bodies decompose, look at the muscles, look at the organs, and he'd actually pull down the bones and actually assembled an entire human skeleton from one hanged person that he took with him as he studied and taught throughout the rest of his life. So he had a really good knowledge of the ligaments and the bones just from looking at these specimens that he came across because they were just left out to the elements. He studied in Louvain and then Paris and got his doctorate in one of the most important schools in the early Mediterranean areas, Padua, and he immediately became the instructor of surgery and anatomy there upon his graduation. So nice graduation present, you get a job as a professor right away. Now he acted as both the professor, the lecturer, and the ostensor, the person who was cutting, pointing, and lecturing, and he decided that he really didn't like the way he'd been taught. So he would do dissections. He'd have that mounted skeleton with him while he taught, and he'd actually try to illustrate what he was getting at with his students by pointing to things on the skeleton, pointing to things on the body, and making him one of my heroes. He thought that people who despised manual labor really missed the point, that people who didn't put in the work manually were missing a lot of the work. It's by doing with your whole body, observing with your mind, and doing with your body that you learn the best way. So his discoveries convinced him that Galen was wrong about a lot of things. And I have a funny story real quick here. So this statue is on a beach island in Greece called Zante. And my lovely wife, who's here tonight, went with her friends for an all-girls bash in Greece and called me and said, oh yeah, Anna's taking us to this cool beach island. Oh, what's it called? Zante. You're going to the one Greek island I really want to see. And this statue was there, and I don't think you said you ever saw it, right? Didn't see it. So yeah, it just kind of tore my heart out a little bit. But he discovered that the errors in Galen were not trivial. A lot of the muscular attachments, ligamentous attachments, were just plain wrong. Blood cannot move between the right and left ventricles. There's no holes there that allow mixing of this pneuma and the blood. And probably most damningly, there is no rete mirabile in humans. Some animals do have it. Some animals have a network of vessels, at the base of their brain, but we do not. This thing is the cornerstone of Galenic physiology, and it doesn't exist. So what's going on? Well, what what Vesalius figured out is basically that Galen never dissected a human. He only dissected apes and monkeys and basically said, well, what holds true for them has to hold true for people. And in some things, yes, but in other things, definitely radically no. So being misled by those specimens led to a lot of mistakes throughout the history of medicine. Now, imagine you're someone who's proving Galen, the unquestioned authority for 1,300 years, wrong. What are your colleagues going to do? They're going to rally to your defense, or are they going to be upset that you're rocking the boat? Yeah, it's option B. So basically his colleagues just were incredibly upset with him for questioning Galen, trying to prove Galen wrong. One of his teachers actually said that if Vesalius was right, it wasn't that Galen was wrong, it's that the human body had changed in an intervening time. So he basically got really tired of constantly having to defend himself from all these attacks, burned a lot of his records, which really stinks because he was doing a lot of interesting work that could have been a lot of pathology anticipated, and became one of the court physicians for the Holy Roman Emperor. That didn't work out as well as he'd like either, so he went on a pilgrimage, and on the way back on Zante or Zakynthos in Greece, he died there, and hence the statue. So one of the most important things about Vesalius' work is that it was written up in a book called De Humani Corpora Fabrica. And in addition to being accurate in the way that the anatomy was presented, it was demonstrated in the best way possible. A student of Titian's, a guy named Stephen von Kalkar, did the illustrations for the book. Now let's take a look at what some of these anatomical sketches were before Vesalius and his work. Here's the skeleton, according to Avicenna. Now, if you look at some of our pictures in a book, some of them are schematic. They're not all meant to be 100% realistic. But if you look at these bones, do these bones look accurate in really any shape or form? No, they're really abstract. This one, Anatomy of a Pregnant Woman. I cannot figure out what is going on in this illustration. So you've got the liver kind of side by side with the heart. Heart's really far down there on the left side of the body. There's all these tubes going lots of different directions. They don't really tie together anything. And this was considered to be A, accurate, B, useful, and a good illustration of what the human body looked like. So we jump ahead to Stephen von Kalkar's woodcut illustrations for Vesalius, and it looks like this. Now these illustrations are not perfect, but they're really good. I could teach from these in a pinch if I had to. I could use these illustrations to teach an anatomy course and point out, oh, there's not actually a duct here, don't worry about that. So by and large, they're very useful and they're a huge improvement over what was present at the time. So, my best day ever. Was it, and these people are here, was it my graduation, getting my PhD? That was nice. Was it my wedding? Hey. Was it the birth of my children? Oh, they're here too. Oh, I don't know how my wife is so photogenic after, having 2 little people taken out of her. Those were my 3 best days. But also in the mix is the day I got to handle and inspect a copy of De Humani Corpora Fabrica for myself. They made me wear the white gloves, which was fun. So there we go. And look at it, it's huge. These things are not small. All right, so last name we're going to bring up now, because we're moving from the Renaissance into basically the early modern or Enlightenment era, is another person at Padua is a student from England named William Harvey. Now, William Harvey is considered to have made the single biggest contribution to Western medical thought, although, as we've already seen, it wasn't unprecedented, but it was independently discovered by him, and that is the circulation of the blood. He basically looked at the setup with Galen and decided it just made no sense. He was unaware of the work of Ibn al-Nafis, so he kind of came up with this on his own. He tied off the pulmonary artery and inserted a tube into the right ventricle and really tried to pump water into it, and he could not get any fluid to move past that ventricular septum, basically showing that there's no way for Galen's mechanism of blood and fluid mixing to have occurred. He also did something that, shockingly, people hadn't thought of before. Despite all the bloodletting that had happened throughout history and the fact that you can see these valves superficially in people, he was the first person to really document that you can milk the blood out of these veins, pick up one finger and no fill happens, pick up another finger and the filling happens, and that their blood is actually moving in a single direction from distal to proximal. And for those of you who had physiology today, you can also thank William Harvey for the first quantitative study in medical history. So all those equations you've had to work on started with William Harvey. He said, okay, if the body pumps this much blood per heartbeat and the liver has to create that blood and it washes out to the organs and there's no mechanism for return, your body has to create over 500 pounds of blood anew every single day. So that just can't be. There has to be some way that this blood is recycled. And so he theorized the existence of capillaries, something microscopic that was connecting the arteries to the veins. And this was eventually proven when the microscope came along, and that the flow of blood from the heart to the periphery and back was established. He established the pulmonary circuitry as well. And something that Ibn al-Nafis hadn't done was he looked at how the embryonic heart changed. So when we talked about that in another class, if you were present at the anatomy job talk yesterday, that idea of how the embryonic heart transitions to mature circulation was also described by William Harvey. All right, that's where we're going to end tonight, and we've got a pretty good starting point. When we come back, we're going to jump back to ancient times briefly, and then all the way up to the modern era, and discuss theories of disease, then theories of how we can treat people, what worked, what didn't work, and then the history of surgery and how an understanding of anatomy allowed people to develop actual surgical skills that could do something, and then how microbiology and anesthesia made surgery actually practical for people to get done under less than extreme duress. All right, it's been a pleasure. Does anyone have any burning questions? The skull is still back there on the back table, and make sure you've signed in if you haven't already. Any questions? All right, it's been fun. I'll see you guys next time. Oh, and I have to say, when you're standing up at a podium like this, it's easy to feel like you're a smart person, but this smart person went to the doctor earlier, and I had Dr. Miller give me the DTaP booster, the Moderna booster, and the flu vaccine all in one day, so you may not see me tomorrow.